Now it's time for another presentation that will be held by Jakub Nesetril, founder of esko.Digital and founder of Apiary.
All right, sorry for a slight delay. I think we're running slightly ahead of schedule. So, thank you so much for having me here. This is my second time on Prague Data City Congress. I was here last year as well, talking about my three loves: open data, open API, and open source. Today, it's going to be very boring. I'm just going to talk about open source, so you get just 1/3 of last year. But specifically, I'll try to talk about open source in public institutions, and I'll try to talk about how I see open source in public institutions in Czech Republic. So I do realize that there's viewers from other countries, and I think it will be very interesting to contrast the situation here and abroad, and highlight some of the challenges that I'm seeing here. So, that in mind, last year, I took the liberty of quoting myself in my slides. Last year, I had this theory that creating applications on top of open data, which is what we talked about a lot, requires invention. You need to have an idea about what to do with data. You don't need a lot of ideas about how to extend open source. It already works. It already does something useful. Usually, you just really need to do like one more thing, scratch your own itch. You know, it's very low bar to entry, as opposed to open data, which has quite a high bar to entry. So that was the 20-minute talk from last year, highlighted in one slide. This year, I will have a new quote for you. All custom developed, publicly procured software should be open. Now, why do I think that? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. What is it? Why only custom developed? And what are some of the pitfalls and challenges? So, why do I want to talk about it? I am a founder of a nonprofit called esko.Digital. For those of you who are not from Czech Republic, you probably have no idea what the nonprofit does. For those of you who are from Czech Republic, I hope you already know what we do. We are a community of IT volunteers, and we are in this space that in English is called civic tech. In Czech, it sadly does not have a suitable name, but in English it's called civic tech, which I think stands for civic technology. It stands for civic society using technology and kind of public participation in civic society. We started last year, really pretty much exactly 1 year ago in May, and today we have 2,500 volunteers, so it's quite a force to be reckoned with. We're a group of developers, designers, but not just those. We're also marketing people, product managers, even lawyers, and many, many other professions that are joining in. And we're all united in this kind of NGO to help the nonprofit sector and the public institutions with technology, because we feel that it's, from a technology perspective, these areas are underinvested, technologies are underutilized, and Czech society is very technically literate. We are playing the first league when it comes to IT companies, and we should play first league when it comes to digitization of our public institutions as well. So, right, and we're working strictly pro bono. We don't accept any money from the partners that we're working with, but as a side effect, we also worked strictly open source. And what I mean by that is that I'm not a religious zealot that will refuse to use Microsoft Office or Google Analytics because it's not sufficiently open. But any code that we produce and that we own as intellectual property is published under an open source license. So if a public institution wants to work with us and they want our work and they want our help, we can only hand stuff over to them as an open source project. And that's why I'm talking about open source in public institutions. Good. So when I get started, especially for international audience, there is an existing initiative on an EU level, public money, public code. It's on publiccode.eu, and a lot of the ideas that we're trying to advocate here in Czech Republic are also on that website, kind of supported internationally, or at least on an EU level. So why public money, public code? Well, first of all, we, as citizens, already own it, right? We bought it with our taxes, we bought it using the money of our government, at least we should have bought it, because a lot of times you're getting IT publicly procured projects that are really only buying a time-limited license. They don't actually own the code, they don't own the intellectual property of what they publicly procured, and it is an attractive option because it might be cheaper, at least in the short term. But in the long term, usually what comes around to bite you somewhere, which I'm not going to specify, is that you don't own the code, you don't own the product, which you became dependent on, and you get into what is called a vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in means that I can't leave the vendor because I'm dependent on his technology, but I don't own it, and I'm in this servitude to the IT supplier that I now have to pay every year or every regular amount of time, new fees, in order to just keep existing as a public institution. There's a big movement now and a big realization that vendor lock-in is certainly not the way to go with public IT projects, and there's a lot of movement towards, at least for all publicly procured projects, to have full intellectual ownership, IP ownership of the IT projects. And if we already own the projects as government, as public institutions, then I think it's not just property of that institution, but by extension, because it's procured using our money, it should also be owned by the citizens of the country. Now, that is not the same thing as owned by everybody in the world. So you could theoretically try to draw this fine line, which, for example, there are examples of that. BBC is a TV company run using public money in UK, and you can watch it for free if you are in UK. But you cannot watch it for free if you are abroad, or if you're not a UK citizen. So there is this attempt to say we've publicly procured this content, paid for it using public money, it should be free, but it should only be free to the people who are actually paying the taxes, not to everybody. Unfortunately, with software, that is not such a simple task, so we're abstracting away a little bit here and saying if it's publicly procured, it should be owned by everybody in the country, so it should just be open source and available to everybody. Next, there is really no downside. Now, this is where I get a lot of pushback. Right? Open source is so difficult. We've never done it before. It's there will be a lot of extra cost involved. We, as a public institution, cannot require open source because that would not be a frugal use of resources. That's the frequent objection here. In fact, once it was extrapolated even further and said we should actually actively allow vendor lock-in because the vendor can get more money out of our institution later down the road, so it's going to be cheaper as at the starting point. And I think really that is a very short-sighted view of things. So first of all, very at a minimal level, open source is about taking your intellectual property and declaring it that it's licensed as an open source thing. That is free. That is literally putting one file somewhere in a repository and it's finished. You can have a lot more than that. You can actively support it, etc. And then it can be, you improve your documentation and a lot of other things. And then, of course, it becomes more costly. But that is only about your level of support of an open source project. Licensing it as open source does not incur any extra cost if you already own the intellectual property as an institution. And no void revenue, I mean, I'll skip that for now. Now, there's another reason why all publicly procured custom projects should be open sourced, and that is public scrutiny. The public should be able to see what you're doing, they should be able to review what you're doing, and they should be able to understand what you're spending the money on. In fact, a lot of the times these IT projects end up influencing people's lives, they end up being part of the fabric that we live every day, and being able to scrutinize that and understand how it works is in public interest. As a nice example of it very recently, we've just all went through this global pandemic, and it is not just Czech Republic, but many countries around the world that responded to the global pandemic by building digital tools that are doing contact tracing to understand how the disease is spreading. That's a very controversial topic, right? It's on the borderline between state surveillance, IT, violation of privacy. And to be honest, disease control is always at the borderline of violating privacy and civic liberties. You can be impounded at home, you can be required not to go anywhere. All of these things are very controversial, and people don't like them. That is exactly why they should be publicly scrutinized. You can't get away with these things if you hide them somewhere under the carpet and you pretend they don't exist and you do it secretly. That is just going to backfire. The only way to do this is in plain sight and fully public. And there are unintended, possibly, side effects, positive of that, that it allows international cooperation on a completely different scale. And that's where we get to the last point, which is public-private partnership. That's, for example, where my nonprofit as esko.Digital comes in. If your governmental project is open source, it invites third parties to collaborate on it with you if you want to do so, right? And there are many examples of digital services in our country and in many other countries where it is in public interest to be cooperating with the government. One nice example of that here in Czech Republic is datové schránky, which is data box. I think it's called data box in English. It's basically email, but validated and with legal consequences. Now, this is an infrastructure that interconnects public institutions, allows you to perform legally binding tasks, allows you to file tax returns. There is a whole army of businesses that are dependent on this. Accountants, legal firms, all of these have vested interest in this technology working, being integrated into their tools, being integrated into their corporate systems. If this was open source 10 years ago, I am fully convinced that there would be a whole group of companies working side by side with government because it is in their own business interest for this technology to work really well, if the government would allow that. Now, those are reasons why public money should mean public code. And if the clicker allows, right. I also wanted to show you that it's not just Mr. Nesetril, who's such a crazy lunatic that is promoting this idea. There's over 200 institutions signed onto the public money, public code declaration on the EU level, over 30,000 individual signatories. And you should also realize that none of these companies actually have a vested business interest in promoting that. They just really believe that's the right thing to do. So that is a lot of companies and nothing to sneeze at. And a lot of them are actually leaders in their respective fields. Free Software Foundation, Wikimedia, etc. Let's keep going. Now, here we get to the nitty-gritty, the difficult parts, the things that are not so easy. When you say open source, what exactly do you actually mean, right? So first of all, if you have an open sourced end result that consists of a certain amount of code, and the end result is open sourced, but it's depending, 90% of the code is depending on some libraries or products that are closed source. Is that still open source? I'm not telling public institutions that they should require that Microsoft Office is not used because it's a proprietary product, or Google Analytics shouldn't be used because it's a proprietary product. That's not my mission. I'm saying only things that are developed for the government, custom developed, that are paid using our money and is developed for the government, they should be open sourced. But what if that's relying on an external database, let's say, and the external database is proprietary? Is that still open source, right? I tend to gravitate towards towards yes, that's okay. You can use dependencies, you can use external assets that are proprietary, and as long as the custom developed portion is open sourced, that's okay. But it's definitely a loophole. If I was a vendor and I wanted to deliver something to the government and I didn't want to open source it, I would pretend that I've just custom developed an information system for the Ministry of Health, in my own free will, because I thought that could be a good product to sell internationally. And then when the Czech Ministry of Health comes, I will repackage this existing product that I've developed internally and just put a little bit of open source paint on top of that and say, oh, here's your open source project that relies on my closed source project that I've developed for somebody else, right? And I keep the ownership of 90% of the project, and I just kind of masquerade it as open source. It's called open washing or open source washing. Another question is, what exactly do you mean when you say open source? Does it mean that I just license it as open source? Or does it mean that I actively publish the source code, which is slightly different? I put it somewhere on GitHub or on code.gov.cz or whatever other governmental server housing open source projects you can think of. Do I actually actively promote it? And then more importantly, and that's where it gets really difficult, does it mean that I actually have to actively collaborate with third parties? That is often what we think about when we think about open source. We think, oh, that's great, it's going to be public, anybody can contribute to it. No, they can't, unless the government actually cooperates. And where it gets really difficult is with outsourced IT contracts, which is where vast majority of the IT is coming from in our public institutions, because then you're running into incentive problems. If you're an IT supplier, you really want to do just the minimum work possible to meet the required assignment and nothing more. You're really not incentivized to add of your own free will some proactive, I don't know what. Now, it's very hard to put into that contract that you would also like the external outsourced IT vendor to be actively maintaining some community, accept pull requests. You know, that's a hazy area where suddenly you're running into this problem that you're outsourcing stuff out, outsourcing responsibility out, and you don't trust the vendor to make decisions for you, but you also don't make the decisions yourself, and it's difficult to put into a contract, at least under existing kind of patterns that a lot of offices are used to. I think it's solvable, but it requires a change. So I went through why open source should be used a lot more often than it is. I went through the hazy gray areas of where it's unsure, where it's undecided, where it's difficult, and things that we need to sort through in order to have successful open source projects. What do we do about it? This is a very short part. I'm not a prophet. I don't really know. I am just providing inspiration and starting points and being very respectful to the fact that there is an international audience here today, and many countries are well ahead of us in this respect. The two that I like particularly and I follow and show to others are Technology Code of Practice from Government Digital Services in UK. I think it's a very well-structured document, simple to read, full of excellent advice on how to run technology projects. And a very similar document from USA, from 18F, at least I think it was called 18F a couple of months ago. Now it's called TTS, Technology Transformation Services, which has a handbook de-risking custom technology projects. And the reason why I like these is because when I talk about these things here in Czech Republic, the response I get is, you're a guy from business environment, you know nothing about how government projects work. This is never going to work because that, or that, right? And that moment, you need to go abroad and say, look, I realized it might not be working under Czech legislation right now, but it is working in other governments. This is not something that's inherently impossible to do in a public institution scenario. We need to work on it. We need to find ways how to get there. But I want to stop this hand-wringing that just because we're in governmental space, we can't actually allow ourselves to build open source projects. I included two starting points and links in Czech Republic as well. One of them is our esko.Digital příručka řízení státních IT projektů. If you can't pronounce it, that's perfectly okay. You're not missing out on anything. It's just the 18F document translated into Czech, so you can read it in original in English. The other one is from a different company called Digitální Česko, which is something very different from esko.Digital. Standard digitální služby, which is the British document translated into Czech. So both of those are in English and Czech version. It's very refreshing, in fact, that both of them are very similar, despite coming from two different governmental practices and from two different offices within those governments. And it just shows that the underlying technology is common for all of us across the world. We have different laws, we have different cultural standards, we have different institutions, but we have the same technology. And some things need to work everywhere the same. Now, as a closing thought, one thing that I find particularly common across these projects and that I draw from and that I think is an underlying message that you should take away, this is going to be the last slide, that you should take from this is successful projects need strong internal product owner. They can't just be thrown across the wall and said, here's a specification of what the law requires me to build. Go, IT vendor, and build it. I abstain from responsibility, vision, leadership, product definition. None of that. You just go and build it based on specification. That is usually something that's going to fail. I mean, it's probably going to meet the requirement of the law. Nobody's going to be happy about it. 5 or 10 years later, it's going to get replaced with a new system, which nobody's going to be happy about either. But that's okay, because it's not your fault. So successful projects do need a strong internal ownership. And in my experience, at least from what I'm seeing in Czech Republic, at least partial in-house implementation. I'm not saying that we can only implement IT projects within the government and within the public employees. That's not realistic. The skill set isn't there. The know-how isn't there. The budget isn't there. But there needs to be part of the implementation in-house so that you don't dilute the intellectual property, you don't dilute the know-how, you don't dilute the vision of where you're taking your product as a public office. And if you do that, I think you're well positioned to go into open source as well. You're well positioned to reap the benefits of public-private cooperation. You're well positioned to give something back to the society. And actually, you're probably starting on a path of having happy constituents later down the road. So that is my final thought. Thank you very much, and I will yield to questions if there are any.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing your energy. That was very refreshing. That was Jakub Nesetril, founder of esko.Digital.